Now, moving to another story that is a really big one on the international stage. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad arrived in China on Thursday on his first visit to the nation since 2004. Now, when it comes to Western isolation, Assad knows firsthand as he and his country have survived more than a decade of crushing sanctions and isolation, amid U.S.-led attempts to overthrow him that included a U.S. military occupation of Syria, which continues to this day. Now, the Syrian leader is set to attend Saturday's Asian Games opening ceremony with more than a dozen other foreign dignitaries before leading a delegation and meetings in several Chinese cities. He is scheduled to meet with President Xi Jinping on Friday and has further meetings on Sunday and Monday in Beijing. Now, as Reuters noted, Assad's visit to China back in 2004 was the first by a Syrian head of state since ties were established in 1956. China, similar to Russia, was a key ally that maintained relations with Damascus as others isolated Assad over the U.S.-led efforts to remove him from power. Now, reports also noted that along with the U.S., Syria faces sanctions from Australia, Canada, and European states, but bids to impose multilateral sanctions have not secured the support of the UN Security Council, where China and Russia both have a veto. China has used its veto at least 8 times on UN motions condemning Assad's government. Syria, a small oil producer, holds strategic significance for China as it lies between Iraq, a major oil supplier to China, and Turkey, a main port of economic corridors stretching across Asia into Europe. Syria also joined China's Belt and Road Initiative in 2022. CGTN noted that both Syria and China are seeking to strengthen links in commerce, finance, and culture under the framework. The bond has strengthened as China offered assistance in the aftermath of the deadly earthquake that struck Syria and Turkey back in February.
今年2月初，叙利亚发生强烈地震，中方第一时间启动紧急人道主义救援机制，向叙利亚提供了总值3000万元人民币的物资和现汇援助。为了支持叙利亚灾后重建，中方加快落实紧急粮食援助，并追加提供了价值1000万元人民币的225套简易板房。我们将继续同国际社会一道，支持和帮助叙利亚人民尽快克服灾后困难，实现恢复重建。
President Assad's visit comes in the wake of the landmark deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran that was mediated by China and which analysts say has sparked a flurry of diplomacy in the Middle East. Experts also say that President Assad's visit to China is intended to help extend his country's influence in the Middle East and deepen areas of cooperation with China. So let's get into all of this now with our next guest. Joining me now is Carl Zha, host of the Silk and Steel podcast on China, history, culture, and politics. Carl, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Rachel.
Now, when it comes to Assad's visit to China, just how significant is this trip?
It is a pretty big deal because this is the first official visit by Assad to China in almost 2 decades, for obvious reasons, because Syria was involved in a long war, in a long proxy war waged by U.S. and NATO countries. Assad had his hands full. On the other hand, throughout the Syrian war, China is one of the main backers of the Syrian government, along with Russia. While Russia provided the military assistance to the Syrian government, China provided economic assistance. And now, while Syria is still under severe Washington sanction, China can provide serious financial help in reconstruction of Syria, which Syria desperately needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because when I read reports on this meeting, they always mention the fact that, oh, China stood by Syria. And of course, that's coming from a lot of the Western press saying it as a bad thing, because we know that the United States, as you noted, the U.S. and its Western allies tried very, very hard to overthrow Assad. And they use the classic campaign where they call on everyone to isolate Syria and they expect the rest of the world to comply. But you had countries like China and Russia that did not comply. And the U.S. has not forgotten about that. So when it comes to the tensions that both China and Syria are facing with the U.S., do you see that as common ground that has brought them even closer than they may be otherwise?
I mean, China and Syria also has a long traditional relationship, as both were emerging from Western colonialism, and the U.S. pressure just bring them even closer. And China is also seeking to build the Belt and Road Initiative. The Middle East obviously play a very important part. Syria sits along the eastern Mediterranean coast, and it can serve as a conduit for transport of goods. Syria is very eager to play that part, and as Syria has signed on the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, U.S. action in Syria is quite obscene. After sticking Syria with a long civil war, which Washington waged by proxy by supporting various jihadist outfits, Washington still maintains a very stringent sanction on the Syrian economy. It's imposing a chokehold to trying to do a regime change by making the Syrian people so miserable that they think they might overthrow their government. Of course, that ploy didn't pan out. This is where China comes in, because China throws Syria an economic lifeline during the war. And now when Syria desperately needs capital to reinvest in its economy, to develop its infrastructure, and this is, again, China can play a vital role in the reconstruction of Syria.
Yeah, and I think we saw this really, so much of this when it comes to Syria hasn't been talked about for a few years, when it comes to just how devastated the country has been from this U.S.-led conflict, from the U.S. funding of extremists there, and also from the continued U.S. occupation. I mean, the U.S. has not left Syria, and at least Donald Trump was very open about the fact that the U.S. was stealing Syria's oil, and they didn't see a problem with it. And then you get Joe Biden come in, and he does not change anything on his end. And then when we had that devastating earthquake earlier this year, it was so interesting to see countries in the West say, oh, well, we can't, send aid to Syria because we've got all these sanctions, or we can only send it to, the Western approved separatists on their end. And then you have a country like China that's like, no, we're just sending aid to them because the people need aid. They've been through so much over the last decade. Now they've just been through this earthquake. What kind of a message does that send to the Syrian people when you have a country like China that is coming in and saying, hey, we are, helping you for the sake of the fact that you need help, and that this is a partnership that we want to pursue that's mutually beneficial?
I think it's definitely very encouraging for Syrian people to have such a strong backer. And now let's not forget, U.S. still maintain ground troops in Syria. U.S. and its proxy occupies about 1/3 of the soil of Syria, where most of the Syrian oil resources reside. And U.S. proxies have been siphoning off these Syrian oil resources and to pipe them through Iraqi Turkestan, through Turkey, to sell to Israel. This is really, really obscene. While U.S. is stealing the lifeblood of Syrian people, is trying to choke off the Syrian economy.
Syrian oil in paying off the Syrian separatists, the number one damage is the Syrian people. Today, the Syrian government cannot turn on the electricity more than 1 hour or 2 hours maximum in 24 hours. I don't think the people of Washington, D.C. or California, LA will accept getting 1 hour or 2 hours of electricity. The Syrian government is trying and doing their best in importing and buying the oil from friendly countries. While they have the oil, but this oil and gas that runs the cycle of the economy of the country, it's being stolen by the Americans.
And what China can do is, and China can include Syria in its Belt and Road Initiative, and by building infrastructure, by building ports, building roads, building more global connectivity, it will help to reintegrate Syria into the global community.
Yeah, and that's something that the U.S. certainly doesn't want to see happening. So it's always kind of fascinating to see how it's like you've got these direct tensions between the U.S., with China and Russia, and then you also have the other countries where the U.S. is trying to destroy them, and then you've got countries like China and Russia that are coming in and helping them not be destroyed. I mean, that's one of the main reasons why Assad is still in power and why Syria is still standing in a lot of ways. Now, when it comes to these meetings that he's having in China and meeting with Xi Jinping specifically, do you expect to see any more agreements come out of that, or do you think that it'll just be the furthering of the work that they're already doing together as it relates to the Belt and Road Initiative?
I think it will be a continuation, but I wouldn't be surprised if some major announcement will be made, because China have long sought to invest in the Syrian economy, and Syria also desperately needs more capital investment in its battered economy resulting from the war. And the fact that this is an official visit by Assad in a long time, I expect to see some concrete result from this visit.
Yeah, it'll certainly be interesting to see what comes out of it. Now, while I have you here, I do want to ask you about China's foreign minister. I know the last time that we talked about a Chinese foreign minister, he didn't last too long after that.
Chinese foreign minister Qin Gang met with Blinken for 7.5 hours. I mean, somebody should give Qin Gang a medal. I don't know how anybody can listen to Blinken for that long.
So not wishing the current one any ill will, but I am curious, he had some talks with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan of the U.S. in Malta, and then went over to Moscow for talks there with Russian officials. What do you make of the current dialogue that we're seeing between officials of the U.S., China, and Russia?
I think right now, U.S. administration also realized that it is vital to maintain a communication link between themselves and the Chinese government, despite all the rhetorics, because right now, U.S.-China relationship is at its lowest point since 1972, since the Nixon visit to China, mostly due to the action of the U.S. government by leveling tech sanctions on China. It will be interesting to find out what has been said. So far the official press release from the U.S. State Department has been pretty generic statement. I would be very much would like to be a fly on the wall in that meeting. But the fact that Wang Yi immediately went to Russia to meet with his counterparts tells me that China and Russia are still maintaining a solid united front. They are sharing information. They are, maintaining a collective stance towards the West and U.S. in particular.
Yeah, it certainly has been interesting to see, you have the dialogue, but there's also kind of the reassurance there that, China is sending a message to Russia when they're saying, hey, we're going to make sure that you're clued in on everything. They're also sending a message to the United States a little bit and letting them know, hey, this is a main ally that we have here. This is not someone that we are going to depart from. Now, we've got a little over a minute left here. What are you keeping an eye on when it comes to these ongoing tensions between the U.S. and China and Russia, I guess, as it relates to on a global scale in the coming weeks?
Right. Like Xi Jinping said when he visited Moscow, and we are at a point where changes have been happening that we haven't seen in 100 years.
Это как раз сейчас перемены, которые не было в течение 100 лет. Как вместе двигаем эти перемены. Перекиньте, пожалуйста, дорогой друг.
Right now, Washington has been failing in sanction against Russia and China. During the visit of Gina Raimondo, Huawei launched its new flagship phone, which was not supposed to happen. And so we will have to wait and see whether the U.S. government will reevaluate its action or dig in its heels further. Currently, the U.S. sanctions are not working. U.S. foreign policy is not working. And we'll just have to see whether Washington elite will come to the reality-based world.
Yeah, that's always the question. Are they going to come to the reality of, this new multipolar world order that we've seen emerging? Are they going to wake up and realize, wait a second, the policies that we have in place are pushing all of these countries that we claim not to like closer and closer to each other? Or is that their goal all along? I guess we'll just have to wait and see, and we'll have to have you back on to talk about all of it. But I always appreciate your time. Carl Zha, host of the Silk and Steel podcast on China, history, culture, and politics. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you, Rachel.
And that's going to do it for today's show. We have a few items that we're keeping an eye on, so do stay tuned. Come back and join us tomorrow as we talk more about this crazy ongoing world that we're living in, and we finish out the week together. Be sure that you're following The Backstory on Rumble. You can join in on the live group chat there and comment on the show as it's going on if you're watching this live. And you can also follow me on my page on Rumble or on Twitter and Telegram at Rachel Blevins. Thank you so much to today's guest and to our production staff and our control room over in DC for making this show possible. And of course, thank you to you for listening. We'll be right back here tomorrow on The Backstory.